Hello,
I'm Ariel Kroon.
and I'm Christina de Rocha. Welcome to Season 3 of Solarpunk Presents,
The podcast introducing you to the people working today to create a future we'd like to live in.
because
If Solarpunk as a genre of fiction dreams about the just and sustainable world we'd like to live in the future,
Solarpunk as a movement rolls up its sleeves and gets down to the business of bringing it about in the present. Welcome to episode 3.4 of Solarpunk Presents, in which Ariel interviews Elia Ayoub, the creator behind the podcast The Fire These Times. Before we continue, I'd like to break in to say I hope you've been enjoying our podcasts. We put a lot of work into them to make them interesting for you, but we could use your support. Join our Patreon at www.patreon.com/solarpunkpresents for a few dollars a month for early access to episodes and bonus content. That would really help us out. Or recommend us to a friend. Or write us a review. All of that will help us grow our audience and keep creating great interviews and discussions for you to listen to. Thanks. And now for this week's episode.
Joey, could you begin by introducing yourself, who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me, first of all. What do? I do a bunch of stuff. So my name is Joey, Joey Ayoub. I grew up in Lebanon, and I currently live in Switzerland. I've been here for 3 years, finishing my doctorate. I have had a podcast since kind of COVID started, really, called The Fire These Times. So it's been, exactly 3 years now, in which I explore on a weekly basis different topics, usually around themes that I find are like underexplored. So this can be anything from like internationalism between different nationalities that aren't usually in conversation with one another. It could be about solarpunk, obviously. And yeah, I write. I'm an editor at Shadow Mag, and I do some smaller stuff from time to time. That's me.
So why did you start your podcast? It was, just before the pandemic or middle of the pandemic. What was the impetus behind it? It's a one-person show. I mean, I'm having some difficulty even doing half the work on this podcast with Christina, and we only publish twice a month. And I'm saying that because I can't imagine deciding to do this weekly and doing it so well. So
Thank you.
Make that decision.
Thanks. I started literally in March of 2020. So it is exactly 3 years now. And so at the very beginning of, at least when the pandemic was announced as such, I started, so I had a previous iteration. I had another podcast with my old blog called Hummus for Thought, and I had named it such as well. But it kind of died out. I was doing it with a friend of mine, a Syrian refugee in the US, and we were not very organized, so it kind of died out. And I knew that I wanted to pick it up again. I wanted to do podcasting. I love the format and I love listening to it. I've been listening to podcasts for goodness knows how long now, and I have a ridiculous amount of to listen on my lists. And
me too.
I guess it felt like kind of a natural thing lockdowns and whatnot kind of gave me the excuse since we were sitting at home anyway. And yeah, I had so much I wanted to say. I had just come back from Lebanon, and things were not going too well, to put it mildly. And obviously, I mean, listeners of your podcast can listen to the one with JD Harlock, who got into it even more. And I guess I had this need, I had this need to talk about what's on my mind. And luckily, some folks found that worth their time.
In this most recent season, I've noticed that you're really focusing in on solarpunk, and I wanted to ask you what first drew you to solarpunk.
So I first encountered it on my own podcast. I asked guests at the end of each episode to kind of recommend 3 books or movies or whatever. And one of them, Emmy Bevancy, we were talking about the online far right and extremism and all of that stuff. Towards the end, they said anything along the lines of Afrofuturism or solarpunk, because, and that's, I'm kind of paraphrasing, and I'm amazed of how people can still maintain hope in today's world. I just remember thinking solarpunk is and it's such a cool sounding term in my mind. It's such something that I'm immediately gonna Google this now, which is what I did, and I ended up basically buying all of the books that have solarpunk in the title, essentially. And I kind of devoured some of the stories and immediately clicked that this is what I want to do. And as with many folks, I looked it up on YouTube. Andrew's video came up called "What is Solarpunk?" from the channel Andrewism. I had Andrew on a couple of times as well. In fact, the second time was with Emmy, the one who recommended Solarpunk in the first place. And so I started this year's episodes with Solarpunk / sci-fi. So the first 3 episodes are on Solarpunk, and the 4th one is on Star Trek with Jesse Gender. And the reason I did so is that a lot of the podcast is very heavy. I tend to talk about topics like war crimes, genocide denial, kind of the trauma behind it. I talk a lot about, we've had a number of episodes on Ukraine, which, obviously difficult, on Syria as well, sometimes on both, and, other topics. But for the most part, it's either heavy, as in it's generally not easy to listen to, and I know that, or it's not necessarily heavy, but kind of, it takes up a sort of a mental space that I feel always need to be balanced out, if that makes sense, with something like Solarpunk. If I'm doing an episode or I'm redoing some research or whatever, that research or that episode gives me more questions than answers. I find myself very unsatisfied. And it's not that I think everything can be answered. That's not the case. Mm-hmm. But Solarpunk for me kind of fills that need of at least trying to imagine what the future might look like if we actually fix certain things and start to heal and find some kind of balance maybe with nature and, all of that stuff. And I like that it's open-ended. I like that it's very new. I literally found myself at one point realizing that, okay, well, I've basically read everything that's been written, more or less, on Solarpunk. And I went on like podcast search engines and wrote Solarpunk, and I've listened to everything there is to listen. I'm obviously exaggerating, but, to some extent it was true. And so that basically means that right now I can just do Solarpunk. I can just talk about it, I can, because it's literally open-ended. Obviously, there are certain things to kind of meet in terms of criteria for it to even count as Solarpunk. But yeah, it was very exciting at a time when, again, like with the beginning of the pandemic, hope wasn't exactly, in excess. We were definitely, it was a dark time in many ways. It still is, but Solarpunk allowed me to balance things out a bit, I guess. I don't know if I guess that makes sense.
Yeah, no, it does. It does. Solarpunk really works as this tool for imaginative expansion and promoting hope and what people like to call hope punk as a genre, the idea of taking hope and really forcing it into these dark places, or forcing these dark places and issues towards the light and towards what might go right with current events, or how can we not just ask questions about them, but how can we ask better questions? Like you said, we don't have all the answers, but we do have all these questions that can lead us into more positive lines of inquiry.
Yeah, and we have some answers, right? Like, it's not like, for example, if we think about global warming, I mean, there are some things we still don't know, but overall, it's not a huge mystery. We're not talking about the universe where, okay, we know that there are most things we don't know about. Global warming, we kind of understand it pretty well. We more or less know in terms of like where the science is at, what needs to be done. We know we need to reduce CO2. We know we need to do rewilding. We know you sit down with a climate scientist, as I've done on the podcast as well, and you say, well, what should be done? And they have an answer. Again, it's not like it's not this mysterious thing that is out of our control. And in fact, one of the many things about global warming is it just feels that if we take this kind of bird's eye view where this alien species like looking down, we would be yelling like, you guys are so stupid. This is really dumb. The fact that we can have that conclusion bothers me, because it says that, well, we're not doing what we need to be doing. and by we, I'm being very expansive here, obviously, there's like a disproportionate amount of harm in the global north and among those the rich versus the poor and so on.
Right.
But like if we take this global lens, for lack of a better term, it really feels that we need to be, that shouldn't be that hard, basically. It should be much easier. We're at a time when we've never had this much information. We've never had in history as many people who are educated, for example, or empowered or whatnot. In many ways, life is much better now than it was like 100 years ago. In other ways, it's not. Mm-hmm. And so supposedly, or one would assume that we have enough of, we have the tools to kind of just make things better. And yet that's not really the case, at least most of the time. There are lots of good things happening, of course. And for me, Solarpunk is one of the ways that's allowing me in any case to expand that imaginary mm-hmm. in a way that is clearly desperately needed. Mm-hmm. And as someone who does cultural studies, so basically I just watch a bunch of movies and series and read books, it did feel like the motifs and the themes and either cyberpunk or post-apocalyptic themes and whatnot, that it's like, well, we've just done this, guys. We've done enough of this. We know, we can imagine what a zombie apocalypse look like. We know what these things look like in terms of like the general themes of like the future is gonna be bad. Yeah, we know, like most people know this by now. It's not, we need to kind of try and not make it bad. We need to make it less bad if that's at all possible. And I feel like, yeah, there's this desire to get out of this post-apocalyptic or even apocalyptic mindset. And I feel like Solarpunk at least does that for me, or helps me do that,
I read recently, or heard from someone, I'm not quite sure where I encountered this, but this idea that, yeah, we have these technical solutions to climate change and global warming, and we, don't have one silver bullet solution, but we have many different ones that scientists are working on right now, and researchers are saying we have these tools that we can use to make the world a better place. But it's a problem of the humanities, if we're talking in academic terms, of narrative and of politics and of the ways in which we live our lives, and think about how are we going to incorporate this new technology and this new science on a sort of more global scale. It's not that we don't have solutions, it's that we don't have ways in which to put them into action.
Yeah, a big thing I've been trying to get into a lot is this concept of realism, what counts as realistic. And obviously Mark Fisher had this term like capitalism, realism. And when I read that book, it kind of clicked that this is what people mean usually when they say, oh, we have to be realistic about things. It's not actually realistic. It's not like a fact-based response. If we say that, well, I say things like, well, maybe we should not have poverty. Homelessness should just not be a thing because clearly there are enough homes, and so on and so forth. Usually the answer isn't, or the kind of, if I'm having this, imagined conversation, it's not you're wrong. Very few people disagree. There are some very extreme right-wingers and quote unquote libertarians or whatnot. But for the most part, people just want a decent society to live in and feel like, yes, it's not fair for someone to live or sleep rough on the streets. It's not fair for someone to worry about paying rent and whatnot. And if there are ways to fix this, cool, that's amazing. But it's like, well, what if we just do it? Like, let's just do it. Let's just agree all together now. Obviously, this isn't, this is a, how do you say, this is like a thought experiment. Usually what's kind of fascinating, that even within a thought experiment, which in theory should have no restrictions because it is quite literally in your mind, there are limits to what feels realistic, because the idea is that, what they say, obviously, as a writer, you have to write what you know. And for most people, that is already a limiting factor, because we live in a world that has rules and assumptions and expectations and whatnot. And we actually take that and we put that into the stories, into the politics that we think is quote unquote realistic, in what counts as science and economics, and so on and so forth. And it was kind of this light bulb moment at one point when I don't remember which text I was reading and whatnot. I was like, well, actually, it quite doesn't have to be this way. Certain things have been done in a certain way. Those are social constructs. They can be constructed differently. And how wonderful would that be? Just that. It started off as a very basic, almost like a childish, and I mean this in a good way, a realization that I have a house, this person doesn't have a house, this makes no sense. And then from that, you kind of extrapolate, and then obviously you complicate it with more data input, if you want to put it that way. And you realize, well, the system that should make that just a reality isn't the system that we have. And so that led me to question the system that we have.
The Socratic method of saying, well, if this, then why?
Basically.
That?
Basically. I mean,
Yeah.
that's the thing, is that it's really not rocket science. And not I mean, some things are difficult, don't get me wrong. I don't want to simplify everything. But in terms of the underlying principle, many of our problems are generally not that complicated. They are rendered complicated, they are rendered difficult through often assumptions like, again, this is not realistic. Like, oh, I'm the serious economist, I'm a serious politician.
Mhm.
Yes, of course, I don't want homelessness as a problem. I don't want people to sleep rough when it's cold outside, And I'm just thinking of this as an example because the city I live in has a lot of folks that are not don't have enough money to pay rent and so on. And this is one of the richest cities in the world. I live in Geneva, literally Geneva. For me, like, it doesn't click, or it shouldn't anymore. It just doesn't work anymore. And Solarpunk just allows me to take these alternative futures that I know are, for the most part, realistic, take them more seriously. I feel like the more we populate that imaginary, whether through mass culture, movies, series, books, or just conversations, the easier it gets to do so. And like the example I always give is like, it's very easy for a 5-year-old today to imagine a zombie apocalypse.
Mhm.
It's just super easy to do. You don't need to know anything. It just kind of pops to your mind. Anyone who's listening to this now is imagining zombie apocalypse. And I want it to be as easy, if not like easier, to just imagine better futures. Even if it's not a zombie apocalypse, if it's like something that has to do with the future, if it's like good, quote unquote, it's always like at some huge cost. Like there was, a third world war in Star Trek, in the 22nd century, or whatever it is. Or it's something like, well, we got to a point where there's no more poverty and whatnot, but that came after 100 years of struggle and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that's a bad thing in and of itself. I'm just curious as to, well, what if we just didn't need that? What if we don't need to get through a catastrophe before we learn our lesson, like that movie The Day After Tomorrow, which is a really bad movie. But the whole like, well, we've learned our lesson from Mother Nature and now we're gonna fix things. Like, maybe we don't need to learn our lesson, quote unquote. Maybe we can just skip the catastrophe aspect of things.
Yeah, but would it be like not to have to hit rock bottom in order to have some sort of revel?
Yeah, why not do something else?
Yeah, I mean, from studying post-apocalyptic fiction myself, I spent a good chunk studying sort of the Christian mythos of there has to be an apocalypse before the new heaven and the new earth can come along, and that's sort of been informing that science fiction imaginary of the end times for so long in our culture.
Exactly.
Well, in Western culture, we take it for granted that things are going to be darkest before the dawn. Things always have to reach this nadir before it can start going up again. Again, that narrative, that imaginary, is what is sort of informing the ways in which we're living our lives, which
exactly
Solarpunk, I think, makes you more able to see, oh, that's a narrative that I'm assuming is reality, and that I'm putting, like, I'm overlaying onto my day-to-day experience, and that's not actually how life works.
I've been finding it very, very interesting that when I put that lens of, like, I'm putting a Solarpunk lens, right? I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna explore TV series and movies and whatnot of any kind, literally, like Seinfeld, The Office. I just like very popular series. I start with things that are very popular because lots of folks have watched them. And so I want to see, well, clearly if it had like 100 million viewers, that has had some impact on the world. And it's like, okay, well, what are certain assumptions in that TV series? What does it do? What is it trying to do? Is it achieving it well? Could it have done it differently? And so on and so forth. And I always find it interesting that even because most of those TV series are Americans, and there's sort of the taboo of terms like communism, quote unquote, or socialism, or even in those situations like The Office, again, or Seinfeld, or I don't know, so many other examples, they can't take themselves too seriously. They cannot take capitalism too seriously because otherwise there is no story to be told. You can't have a Kramer mooching off Jerry Seinfeld and never paying his bills or whatnot if their friendship was operating along capitalist logic. You can't have The Office where we don't even know what they do most of the time because it really doesn't matter. And they know, like, at some point it's like this weird insider joke almost, like they're letting you in on the joke, like they know this doesn't matter. And there's this one employee who's been there for we don't know how long, and we don't know what he does there, and it's kind of like with the butt of the joke, and and so on and so forth. And then when one of them, without too many spoilers, although I feel most folks have watched those, know what I'm talking about, when one of them becomes the boss, he fires one of his employees, as if one of his friends, not because he was doing a good job, but so that he can give his friend / employee like a severance package. And so they was like, well, this is the system we live in. It doesn't make much sense. So we're just going to play around with it and try and us as a team, as a basically a chosen family kind of situation. We're going to just try and help each other out as much as we can. And that's fascinating to me because it's within the logic of a company. We're not talking about a utopian, socialist, whatever landscape. We're talking about just a private company making paper. And almost any of those examples I'm thinking of, almost any of those TV series that's trying to have kind of a slice of life vibe to them, there's always the outside world, but then there's who we are, the Friends group, literally in Friends, or Seinfeld, or The Office, or Parks and Recreation and whatnot. The rules and regulations or the norms that governs their lives is often very different from what they are supposed to be playing as roles. And when they're not, like when they are supposed to be capitalistic, that's when we have the darker series. That's when we have things not going too well, like Succession and stuff like that. Because you can't be a capitalist with your parents, I'm hoping, or you can't be a capitalist with like a friend. By definition, that's not a friend. Like we have this, what I think David Graeber called it, baseline communism, and communism with a lowercase c, not communism in the Soviet Union sense, but just in the sense of literally commonly owned stuff. Right. Where I was like, yeah, sure, I have this book, I finished it, you can borrow it, you can keep it, that sort of thing. And so I'm mentioning all of this just to say that I've been finding fascinating, I've been rewatching stuff that I watched like 20 years ago, because there are stuff like, even in that series or in that universe where they are supposed to be, as I said, again, like in a private company, or they're not able to fully follow the logic of what they're supposed to do, because you can't have a human story if you keep it capitalist. It ends up becoming like it lasts like 1 or 2 episodes, and by the second episode, someone is done and you just move on. You can't have that human connection if you keep it within that logic. And I find it interesting that even when they're not trying to do so, even when they're not trying to make a political point, they end up kind of doing it anyway, because there's no other way of having a human connection, and therefore of attracting enough, of an audience to even make it worth their time.
It seems to me then that, it's the connections between people and the that are actually interesting in these shows, not so much the system in which they're operating, even if it's something like The Office, which ostensibly is about
an office.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why I find so fun. And I think that's why we like it. And the Office specifically, I've been really fascinated by that series, just because of, most folks would go to an office, at least before the pandemic. And it's kind of, it's weirdly bizarre in a way, like you're done with your office, you come home, and assuming you sit on your couch and then you watch a TV series about an office. That's quite something. I mean, it feels a bit dystopian, but it's interesting that even within that context, they are kind of mocking it without proposing a solution, because then it's no longer a comedy, but they are still mocking it, and they are kind of subverting it in some interesting ways, and kind of just like, it's this whole quote unquote postmodern thing of just not taking those rules too seriously.
Thinking about it through a Solarpunk lens, it's the community of people, and
exactly
how much what they're doing that matters. Yeah. It's how they're doing it, and the ways in which they relate together, and that what we're mentioning, the communism, or I've heard it talked about as communalism. Yeah. The way that people interact together, and which exactly. I think is a big part of Solarpunk, in that it sort of emphasizes those really human ties and de-emphasizes the economic or political system, or, I mean, that's still very important, but it's also sometimes it's very helpful to read a book or a story or something like that, where that's just not the emphasis. That doesn't matter so much, because what matters is the way in which people are flourishing and coming together. I was going to ask you about why you decided to incorporate Solarpunk into your podcast, but I think we kind of covered that, because it started out essentially as a political podcast. Would that be sort of accurate to say?
Yeah, it is.
And so Solarpunk sort of intervening in that narrative of global politics. And so I was going to ask you if you saw Solarpunk as sort of fitting into any ideas of political parties or movements that you've experienced.
No, I'm not. No, I don't. Not yet, anyway. I don't know if something like Solarpunk can fit in a logic of like a party system necessarily. I'm not excluding it either, to be honest. There may be ways, and usually for me, party politics tends to dilute or reduce or tone down, if you want, otherwise radical propositions or ideas. So maybe that happens. But I'm not entirely sure if I see this as like the main direction or the main trajectory that Solarpunk is taking at this point. I think Solarpunk, as of now, and it's still very young, it's still very new, is about just challenging these norms. And then at some point, if it becomes part of the mainstream, quote unquote, cultural ethos, and I do genuinely have a feeling that this is going to happen, and I think it is already happening. I mean, if not in like a very explicitly Solarpunk story, it could still be in a story that is, let's say, apocalyptic or whatnot, but you have like a different philosophy that's now into it, which is actually about community, which is actually about making things better and stuff like that. Maybe once that happens in, like, let's say 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, whatever it is, then you will have a need for some other kind of punk to respond to that. Like I don't see this as like the solution for all of our problems forever. I see it specifically as a response to what's happening now. I'm hoping one day we don't need the punk anymore, because punk is by definition, like, it's countercurrent. It's supposed to be challenging the norms and stuff like that. And if the norms are suddenly much better than they used to be when Solarpunk started, well, maybe we need something else now, and that would be fine.
Yeah, I see Solarpunk as sort of a deliberate intervention in these ways of thinking in many different areas of life. And so just thinking about like, okay, how is Solarpunk sort of intervening in politics to sort of speak back to the way that politics are happening in our world right now? I see lots of things, especially in the US with the Green New Deal and that sort of thing. And it's kind of adjacent to Solarpunk, I would say. It's interesting the ways in which there's some people who would, say that anything within the current system of government that we have right now cannot really be Solarpunk at all. Solarpunk demands a radical change. And
it does, but it's also like it expands that horizon, right? Like I don't think there is I don't think there is it's not there yet kind of thing. It's more like almost like by design, you can't get there in terms of like a utopia, but it's more making it more realistic, making it more feasible to actually be there, or to just make things better, and in that very simplistic way. Something else, if that's okay, like I wanted to add that Cyberpunk came at a very specific time. It was a response to a pretty utopian vision of First Man on the Moon, the Jetsons, that sort of thing. And we'll have flying cars by the year 2000, and stuff like that. And at some point in the 70s and 80s, lots of folks started realizing, well, we're clearly not heading there. We're clearly not going in that direction. Obviously at the height of the Cold War and the nuclear threats and stuff like that. And so it came at it served its purpose, is what I'm trying to say, in many ways. But Cyberpunk was pre-internet. It was kind of imagining the cyber, obviously, the internet phase, but for the most part, it was pre-internet. It did not have, at least not to the same extent, interactive mode that Solarpunk has. Like in many ways, we're talking now about Solarpunk, and we're talking about it while also creating it, in the sense that this is an internet phenomenon. This is a phenomenon that came out of the internet. And that's very interesting, because it kind of breaks that dichotomy between or something has to be high tech, or it has to be quote unquote nature friendly, because that the whole point about cyberpunk, as the person I keep on quoting and forgetting his name, so like it's high tech and low life. That's cyberpunk.
That would be William Gibson.
No! Ariel would like to apologize for her brain fart. It was actually Bruce Sterling in his introduction to William Gibson's first book of stories, Burning Chrome.
And whereas with Solarpunk, it's, again, high life, if you want to put it that way. But when it comes to tech, it's like a question mark. Tech has to serve a purpose, has to serve a need. If it makes healthcare better, cool, amazing. We like it. If it makes it worse, we don't want it. We want something else. It can be changed. It's not like, as we're seeing now, obviously, kind of like a trend every 2 years. First it's crypto, then it's AI, then it's whatnot. And then supposedly it's going to save everything. And clearly it doesn't. And so on and so forth. Like we want it to be more a purposeful, we want tech to have more of a purposeful dimension to it. Like we're creating something for a reason, for a purpose, to make things better. And so that's what I like about Solarpunk in a few words anyway.
In our email conversation while setting up this interview, you mentioned that you host a climate anxiety drop-in Zoom chat. Mm-hmm. And I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about that and sort of introduce it to listeners for.
I had just put out a call on when I used to actually still use Twitter, like a couple of years ago, mm-hmm. And saying that this is what I want to do. I want to have at the time it was like once a month, and then we're doing it twice a month now on a Sunday. Clearly, lots of folks are dealing with climate grief, climate anxiety, climate-related fears and whatnot, and we should just talk about it. And what ended up happening is now we're kind of a group of like friends, or at least folks who really know one another, like a dozen or so from different walks of life. And not a lot unites us necessarily from the start. I mean, obviously there's like we're all left-leaning as kind of like by default maybe. But for the most part, the thing we have in common is that we're really worried about a hyper object, as some might call it, like a huge thing that is very difficult to wrap our heads around most of the time. And it just makes it a bit easier to talk about it. Not always. Sometimes when we talk about it, we can actually worsen each other's anxieties. So we have to be mindful of how we talk about it as well, because then it's like doom and gloom, and we're just reinforcing, the worst aspects of things for one another. And so I've been finding it as an interesting, like an experiment. It's been going on for I think a couple of years now. It allows me to digest in many ways, or like to process certain fears and anxieties that I've had during, let's say, the couple of weeks that preceded that session or whatever. And anyone can do it. That's the magical thing about it, is that we have the internet, and most folks have it, at least to obviously there's like an accessibility issue in parts of the world, but in a good chunk of the world, and it's kind of increasing every day, most folks can connect. And and doesn't have to be only that topic, of course. Sometimes we just talk about random things. It doesn't have to be just like today we talk about the climate. It's more like this is the overarching theme. There's this thing that I found very interesting, I should say, that when we know what the overarching theme is, even if we don't talk about it, it makes it easier to process it later on. I found this very interesting. Like if I'm with a bunch of friends, and as I said, I'm from Lebanon, and those friends are also from Lebanon, and let's say have left in a similar circumstance, like escaping the crisis and whatnot. Clearly lots of anxieties are there, lots of PTSD in some cases and stuff like that. If we all meet and we talk about, I mean, Lebanon probably comes up at some point, almost like by default. Mm-hmm. But then we choose, okay, we don't want to talk about this. Like, that's enough. We have this term in Arabic, like khalas, like enough. Mm-hmm. And we want to talk about other stuff now. It makes it easier to be in a Lebanon-related space, like literally with other Lebanese, and then makes it also easier to think about Lebanon. And even if, again, we went in a complete tangent and talked about it, but the tangent might change from place to place or from group of people to another. But then, given that these individuals were there or were kind of united by that specific or by that unique, if you want, circumstance, it makes that circumstance easier to deal with. It's not as atomizing or isolating. And I would say this is a Solarpunk conclusion in many ways, or one that I think I've reached, based out of all of those stories that I've read that are in, well, the only thing we have in common is that there is an apocalypse right now. That's the only thing we have in common. So it brought us together. So what do we do about it? That's Octavia Butler's premise, right? In the parable of the sower. Like, what do we do about it now? And I've been finding that like it literally like an endless series of possibilities just pop up just from that realization.
You say you don't have anything in common, but I think what you have in common is your common humanity.
Yeah.
And the common experience of being alive on the planet at this particular time in the late Anthropocene, just kind of dealing with all the shit that's just happening worldwide. So
yeah, exactly. I mean, 3 years of COVID in like, I'm assuming in like 3 decades or whatnot, it will be almost like a generational thing, like, oh, the COVID generation or the people that went through it, or do you remember when this used to be the case and whatnot? And you will even have, I can guarantee you this, people romanticizing the COVID years, people saying, well, we had it better. We were all connected. We were all, working on the same, wavelength and whatnot, because one thing I found from like studying a lot of civil war stuff, including the Lebanese one, is that you have folks that miss the war. You have folks that really say like we were together. The Blitz spirit, as they would say in the UK. We understood that we were all fighting the same enemy or the same problem, assuming we're not Nazis or we're not militiamen. We're just civilians or whatever. We know why things are tough, like in Ukraine right now. We know what is happening. And Ukrainians have been talking about this for over a year now, that people are coming together and they're working together. And, they're not they cannot be capitalistic in a situation like this, because it doesn't make sense. We would all die if that's the case. We need to come together. And we understand this as humans. That's Rebecca Solnit's book, A Paradise Built in Hell.
I was just thinking about that book. I was going to bring it up if you didn't.
Perfect. But that's the premise, right? That there is this idea of a dog eat dog world and whatnot, which is funny because dogs don't even do that. But things are bad, therefore clearly, it's that whole American prepper male thing. We're gonna shoot each other. I'm gonna have my bazooka in my dorm room or whatever, in my bedroom, I mean. And that's not what people do, because it's dumb to do that. It makes no sense to do that. You can't. So you can maybe live in your bunker for a week, but at some point you're gonna get bored. You need other stuff to do. You need to talk to people and whatnot. And even in the apocalyptic movies, for the most part, you will have, right, like the community that found a way to isolate themselves from the virus or from the zombies or from the whatever, and they are living together. All right, that's the point. It doesn't work if you're on your own. It's not a life that anyone actually wants. And they always think that they are the survivor. You watch a movie like, what's the one with Will Smith? I forgot its name. I Am Legend. And most folks, when they watch that movie, sees themselves as Will Smith in that story. Right. You're the person that survives, and there's a male element to this as well. Obviously, you don't see yourself as like the 10,000 people that died in the first 5 minutes of that movie.
Right. Yeah.
But statistically, you're one of those. Statistically, you're not Will Smith. You're gone for the first 5 minutes, right?
Do you have a goal for your climate group, or just these overarching themes? Does there really have to be one, do you find?
No, there doesn't have to be one. At one point, if there's like 10 of you and 4 of you happen to live in London, which was the case in our chat, they said at one point, hey, clearly we live in the same city. We're talking about this thing every 2 weeks. Why don't we meet up? And they did. And that is that simple. It's almost like it doesn't need to be planned. You can add some intentions to it and say, well, clearly we've been doing this. What if we meet, guys? What if we do this or whatnot? I've been on the Signal group, first started as a Twitter DM group, and then we moved to Signal when we understood that Twitter is not safe. And we didn't have, that much in common when we started. We had this very specific grief of like lefties on the internet that we would now call tankies, that were like apologists of authoritarian regimes. In our case was Syria. We were talking about Syria a lot. So it was a bunch of Syrians, Lebanese, some not, like some Americans and whatnot, that saw this huge problem and saw other people that saw this problem, and they kind of came together based on that. We started chatting. And at one point we created a Signal group that's now 3 or 4 years old. We gave ourselves a ridiculous name just for the fun of it. And also in case the phone is hacked, just in case, but for the fun of it. And we met a few months ago, some of us anyway, or like 8 of us met like in Paris a few months ago. And now, we're friends and we talk about stuff, and it's no longer the thing that brought us together, right? That was effectively like a traumatic thing. There is such a thing as trauma bonding, and that can kickstart a relationship, but it shouldn't define it forever. At some point there has to be something that's transformative or healing, or something that actually you want to be in. You don't want to just meet your friend every day, the friend that reminds you of that trauma. It doesn't make sense. It's just not sustainable. So yeah, all of this to say that, like, as long as you just create the structure to create a community will build itself almost instinctively. I would say, like, add some intention to it, like try and build it at first, at least to kickstart it. And then it will kind of create itself. And we find this again in all of the movies, series that people usually like Gilmore Girls and something I watched recently. People just come together because they live in this community that has the structure of a community. I.e., like, there is a gazebo that's in the center. There is a building that's for like a meeting place every month. And so people go to the meeting place because it's literally a meeting place. It's where you meet. And that's why it's so interesting in Solarpunk situations, just to go back to our main topic, a lot of it has to do with like doing something with the world we live in, with the community we live in, with the city we live in, the village we live in, whatever it is. It's usually at like a smaller scale because that's easier for like storytelling purposes. But I imagine, like, I live on this street that's like a one-way street. I sort of imagine it has like, I'm gonna guess 300 people living here. I'm not entirely sure. It's just like in a bunch of apartment complexes, very working class, very diverse, mostly migrant background like myself. I would imagine that there's a lot of things we have in common. What if we turn this neighborhood into something else? Clearly, this can look nicer. It's all gray. Does it have to be gray? It's cemented mostly for cars. Does it have to be this way? And the answer obviously is no. So let's create that imaginary, essentially. Like, what could it look like if it didn't look that way? I'm not skillful enough to be able to go on Photoshop or Procreate or whatever it is, or just literally draw what I imagine it could be. But statistically, someone in this neighborhood knows how to do that. Like, you have enough of a population, of a certain number, whatever that number is. You will have people that have different skills, different interests, different whatnot. At some point, you will find someone who will meet the need that community needs, right? Like, will be able to actually serve that. The person who's the cook, the person who cleans, the person. And it doesn't have to be one role per person. You can then, alternate or whatnot. And so it's very interesting to just think of it that way, because the alternative is just silos of people that go to work from home, and then after work go to the space maybe and hang out with friends or whatnot, and then go home and then kind of repeat ad nauseum until you're dead. And I don't necessarily think this is the only way to live. Clearly it isn't, and not everyone even lives this way even today. You have lots of folks that do live in communities and whatnot. I'm just trying to like think of like, what would that look like if you have both the local and the global at the same time? Like, things that are working, how do you scale it up? Does it look the same at a local level as it does on a national level? Probably not. Probably other things start happening,
It's true that not everybody has the skills or talents to do everything. And that's okay, because all humans...
Someone else does.
Yeah, like nobody does. But that's the great thing about being in community, is that when large groups of humans get together, then large groups of people who have different types of expertise get together, and you are able to connect people to creating change, right? So
yeah, I think it was Margaret Killjoy that gave this example on one of her podcasts. Like, you have the prepper people that like, I'm gonna know all of the skills and I'm gonna just be my own as this, whatever. It's usually an American thing, but there is a global dimension to it as well. And it tends to be very gendered. It tends to be like male, male identifying. But there's like a fundamental flaw in this individualist prepper narrative, which is that quite literally you cannot know everything and you cannot actually survive on your own. It's not a thing that actually happens for the most part. And even if it is, that's not a fun life. It's not as exciting as you think it is. It's actually mostly difficult. what's easier than trying to, if you're not a doctor, and trying to understand everything about the human body and whatnot, and also at the same time trying to learn skills of like, I'm imagining like the classic prepper scenario of like hunting and fishing and also growing stuff and building houses and whatnot. What's easier is to have like 4 friends that know a bit of those.
Yeah.
It's just easier to do that. Get one friend who's a doctor and you're good. You're good to go.
There's a
So,
reason that humans live in, like groups, like villages and stuff like that.
Yes,
like that's kind of how we do.
Kind of how we do it, and there's a reason for it.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Like realizing the strength in community, and that humans generally like to be around other humans and like to help other humans. I think is a very Solarpunk way of starting to reframe our vision of even just our neighbors, but also our communities and the people that we come in contact with from day to day. Everybody is part of a community, and what does that community look like?
And that's a wrap for episode 3.4 of Solarpunk Presents. Be sure to catch Joey's podcast, The Fire These Times, which you can find at thefirethesetimes.com.
Thank you for listening to Solarpunk Presents,
a podcast hosted and produced by Ariel Kroon and Christina de Rocha.
The audio for this episode was recorded in part on the traditional territory of the neutral Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples.
And in Germany. The opening and closing music for this podcast is Water Cooler Gang by Monkey Warhol, available for use under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International License.
If you like what we do and want to support the podcast,
join our Patreon at www.patreon.com/SolarpunkPresents,
or share the podcast with friends, family, and people you know who might be interested in our guests and what we have to say. We'd also love it if you could write us a nice review on your podcatcher of choice, because every review bumps us higher in the algorithm's priority, so we can reach more listeners.
Until the next episode,
keep dreaming and keep up the good work.